Welcome to Earthtide Studios. I'm Zach Knight, and in today's video, we are looking at phase and how we can get your drum recording sounding awesome. We're going to run through what phase is, how to adjust it in your drum sources, and also a breakdown of the plugin Auto Align. We also have a free vocal production course that teaches you the basics of recording, editing, and mixing your vocals. If you want that, just click the link below, and we've just released our new website as well. But for now, let's get stuck into the session. So you've heard the saying, oh, that needs to be in phase. Oh, make sure you've got your phase correct on that. Oh, have you checked that the phase is right with that source signal in your productions, online, with mixing tip videos, or maybe from other engineers and other producers. But has anyone really explained why and how phase works and how you can use getting things in phase to your advantage with your recordings and with your mixes? I'm hoping that this video can help anyone out there who has got questions about it. And we're just going to jump straight into it and show you what we're dealing right now with in this recording session. So I've got some drums here that I've recorded for a band Color and Shade. This is for the song Rest. And these drums have been edited and recorded well in a nice large room. All of the takes are here. All of the shells and everything are all sitting at 0 dB. I've got some panning going on, and the overheads and the room mics are all turned down a little bit. But other than that, everything is just as is at the recording. We're going to have a quick listen. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on a plugin Auto Align, and I'm going to show you, you can hear the difference of things being the way that they are right now and things being perfectly in phase. Let's have a quick look. So you can hear as soon as I put Auto Align on, everything sounded fuller, bigger. There was more power behind the kick, more power behind the snare, and everything just sounded a little bit more exciting. And what's happening right there is I basically was putting everything in phase. I'm just going to break down exactly what that means right now. We're just going to have a quick look at this kick. Here, the kick in and the kick out. You'll notice straight away that just make it a little bit larger so we can see what's going on here. You'll notice that the kick in and the kick out are not in phase with each other. So what I mean by that, if these were in phase, the apex of the kick in and the kick out would be together at the same point. They aren't. However, the kick out at this point here where the apex of it is starts the opposite side of the waveform, and the actual apex of the bottom of the waveform is here, which is not too far from the top of the waveform for the kick out here. So therefore, these are actually reasonably out of phase. And what that's going to do is it's going to mean that the power of these microphones combined is not going to be nearly as good as it would be if they were in phase. Furthermore, if this, I'm just going to take this here now, if this kick was over just a little bit further here all the way, they would actually be completely out of phase and the kick would sound quite horrible. I'll give you a quick example of that. Let's play right now. And now, let's play again with it out of phase. It sounds tiny, it sounds really small, and it does not sound good at all. Effectively, when the waveform is going all the way up here, and this waveform is... Well, at this point in here, there's nothing happening from the kick out. But at this point here, this waveform going down and this waveform going up here, phase is actually causing the frequencies that are represented in both waveforms that are the same to cancel each other out. Now, there are going to be some differences, of course, because they're not exactly the same audio source. As much as they are both a kick drum, they're literally not exactly the same audio source. So the phase is not going to be completely cancelling out everything to do with the sound, but everything that they share together as a common sound in terms of the frequency and the tonal characteristic of that is going to cancel each other out. However, if we put them in phase by turning Auto Align on, they'll sound fantastic. And the reason being is because when they're in phase, they're going to provide reinforcement to each other. So out of phase, they're going to negate each other. And in phase, they're going to reinforce each other. So this is why it's important for us to get audio sources in phase. So there are a couple of different ways that you can approach adjusting the phase in a recording. Obviously, the most important thing is to make sure that when you are actually recording things like drums or anything where you're going to be having multiple different sources, that you do what you need to do as part of the recording techniques to make sure that you get the phase as close to perfect as possible. However, this video is about dealing with recorded sources and trying to correct the phase with those. With that in mind, we're going to have a look at a couple of different approaches. The first one we're going to look at is manually editing the phase using slip editing rather than using any plugins or anything along those lines. I'm in Cubase and I've set it so that I can manually move any of these tracks rather than having them all grouped together. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the snare and we're going to have a look at the kick. And I'm just going to quickly show you how to get those in phase as close as you can using slip editing. As we discussed beforehand, this is the start of the waveform right here. The apex of the waveform is here. And then the bottom of the waveform is over here. So what we want to do is we want to get the apex of this waveform be matching about here. So there's two different ways you can do it. You can either hold in Control and Alt to slip edit this waveform. However, to do so, you need to make sure that you have some cut sections on either side because this waveform is completely unison with the rest of the waveforms in the drum session. And then you can hold in Control and Alt and slide this waveform until the apex matches together. And then also make sure that the crossover, which is this point right here, matches the crossover from here. Now you can see the issue that we have with this is the start of the waveform, because you could do this and start both of these at exactly the same point. However, then you have these phase issues that start to happen here and then here. You'll find that you need to flip around with it a little bit and try different options, but this is probably the closest that you're going to be able to get to getting these two in phase with each other. The bottom part of this dips down here. Further along from here, it comes back into phase over here. And you sort of don't need to worry about this too much. The main focus is this first two cycles here of the kick drum. So that's pretty close to in phase now. Just take it back to where it was before. And now we're just going to have a quick look at the snare. So I have 3 snare microphones here. I have a snare top 2, and a snare bottom. So let's have a look at this nice big snare over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to get these two sitting in phase. Now, I happen to know that these snares were recorded almost perfectly in phase. This was 2 microphones close to each other, pointed straight at the center of the snare. So that's why they're pretty close. However, as you can see, there still is a little bit of discrepancy here. So we're going to go and we're going to match everything up to this snare top. I'm literally just going to I'm going to hold in Control and drag over rather than using slip editing. It's going to move the whole waveform. I'm just going to bring the start of the snare there. And as you can see, the cycle goes up here and down here, up here, down here. And now that is in phase. However, we also have this snare bottom here, and this is currently out of phase. So what we want to do is we want to bring this over, and I'm actually going to bring it over to this point here so that we can have the waveform going up here and then coming down here and then up here. It's not perfect, but that's pretty damn close. And if you don't have other plugins to be able to adjust your phase, you can definitely go through and do that. It is important, however, to make sure that you do have, drums edited, etc. And when you are editing things, make sure that you're moving everything at once so that if you do make these adjustments in your phase correction, that you're moving everything in the correct relationship to everything else. If you don't have your drums grouped when you're editing and all of those kind of things before you do phase correction, or if you do phase correction beforehand, you can find that you're going to have a lot of different issues. So I do have a video that breaks down how I edit drums in Cubase, so you can run through that in that video there. It's very detailed and runs through how to edit drums. So if you have questions regarding this aspect before doing phase correction, or alternatively doing it the other way around, review that video. So this is Auto Align, and this is an incredible plugin that I love to use to be able to get my drum phase just right. Now, I'm going to preface that I learnt this tip from the producer Jay Mars, and he is a legend. So thank you, Jay, for this advice. I definitely recommend looking him up if you want anything to do with phase stuff, because he is a god when it comes to that stuff. When I set up Auto Align, I like to run it off my left or right overhead track and use that as the guide. So the way that you run Auto Align is you put it on one track, and it'll start off like this when you open it up. Technically, it actually starts like this. And so what you want to do is you want to have one track that is your guide. So that's the reference point that's directing another instance of Auto Align on what the phase it should be trying to correct to is. So this is my overhead hat track, and I will send. So in this particular case, I've just clicked that over to sending to channel 1. And then what I'll do is I'll drag the input up to about -18 and the side chain as well. So this is showing where it's going to detect. And this is at -18 dB for this instance of Auto Align. And this is actually the side chain. So that's showing at what point of detection, what it's sending through on whatever channel you're choosing to send it in, because this is basically an internal routing inside Auto Align itself, is going to detect at what point there. So let's just have a quick listen to that with this left overhead track soloed. So you can see it's peaking at around about -12. However, I don't want it to be at just where it's peaking. I want it to be a little bit more within a confirmation point of all of those snare hits. So it's peaking on the snare hits, and those are what's actually going to be the guide for detecting of the phase. So I've set the side chain up to match that. So now this is primed and ready for another instance of Auto Align to be able to recognize this and correct its phase of that audio source to the phase of what it's sending here. So let's put this over here, and we'll solo the other overhead track. We'll open the instance of Auto Align in this one. Now this has already been adjusted. So what I'll do is I'll just get rid of all of that. If you double click up on this point in here, what it'll do is it'll reset the phase that's been corrected on there. Now, this would be how Auto Align would have been if I had have loaded it up from scratch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to be receiving what this version of Auto Align is sending. So receiving channel 1. I'm going to drag the input up to match the same one, because this is another overhead track, so I know the volume is going to be similar. And I'm also going to drag up the side chain as well. Now, let's have a listen, and you should see the waveform come up here, and it'll start to recognize the correction in phase. So as you can see, it's actually recognizing the signal that's being sent through, and it's ready to detect phase. So what we're going to do now is we're going to tell Auto Align to read the signal being sent to it and try and detect the phase and make a correction. So what we'll do is I'll select this button here to detect delay and polarity, because I like to make sure that it's going to also flip the phase if it needs to. You can choose to press this button and it will only detect the delay. However, I like to detect delay and polarity at the same time. So what I'll do is I will press play, and then I'll click this button, and we'll let it detect over a period of time until it recognizes a figure. So you can see it is recognized that this overhead here has needed to move 31 samples backwards. So that means in terms of the way that you're looking at the waveform to the left of the screen to be in phase. It's a very, very small, very, very minor amount. So it's not necessarily super audible, but what we're going to do is we're going to bypass auto align, and then I'm going to bring it back in and see if you can hear there's going to be a little bit more power in the kick and a little bit more power in the snare as it puts it into phase. Awesome. That has now made sure that these overheads are in phase with each other. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to quickly break down how we can use this on some of the close mics. So let's have a listen to the kick. And what I'm going to do is I'm only going to solo the source that is sending to what I'm detecting and what I'm actually detecting. So let's open up this version of Auto Align here. And as you can see, there's quite a large adjustment here going on the kick. So ignore this for now. We're just going to focus on its receiving. I'll bypass what's going on here and we'll find a section that has a little bit more kick going on. And we are going to clear out what's here, unbypass that, and we're going to detect what's going on with the kick. Let's go. So now the kick is in phase. What I'll do is we'll just have a quick listen, unbypass auto align, and then put it back in again and listen to how much more the kick is in phase. We'll put both overheads on. Got so much more smack and so much more power. We're going to move on to another really cool technique that you can utilize with Auto Align, which is getting the same kind of audio signal in phase with something else. So now I'm going to focus on getting the kick in and the kick out in phase. And to do so, I'm actually going to use the kick in as the guide for the kick out because they're the same effective signal. It's going to be a clearer signal. So what I'll do is I'm going to bypass what's going on here on the kick out. I've set this kick in here to be the second send in the internal routing and auto align. And I've set the kick out to be the second receiving end in the internal routing and auto align. So now what that means is that the kick in is actually guiding the kick out to determine what the phase that is being detected by the kick out version of Auto Align should be. And I've set up the sidechain to make sure that that is being sent through to this version of Auto Align. So now we're going to press play and get Auto Align to detect the phase that the kick out should be correcting to. There you go. Now the kick out is in phase with the kick in. What I'll do now is we'll just close those, bypass, and we'll solo the overheads, and then we'll bypass both versions of Auto Align and then put them back in again and just listen to how much more power there is in the low end of the kick when it gets in phase with what's going on with the overheads. It's a big, big difference. So now that we've got the kick in phase, let's get the snare going too. So I've got another version of Auto Align running on the snare here, and it is receiving from the left overhead, which is what I'm going to be playing, as well as the right overhead. And we're just going to get this set up here with some sidechain, and we're going to detect the phase of the left overhead and get the snare top to match it. And I've got the input and the sidechain set up to make sure that it's getting enough signal. You can hear when that stops and it recognizes the amount of adjustment that it needs to make. The body of the snare gets so much bigger with those overheads. So now that we've got that in phase, I've set this up to be the third send of the internal routing of Auto Align being sent to the snare top 2. And I'm going to bypass the overheads, and we are going to have this instance of Auto Align run. I'll bypass my initial changes, and we're going to detect the phase for the snare top 2. Awesome. Sounds so much better. So much more power. We're going to do the same with the snare bottom as well. Leave it as it would be loaded up. Obviously, it's been sent here to receive from the third send, and we're going to leave that running just with the snare top. And we're going to get that to detect the phase. Instantly, as soon as that stopped, it sounded so much bigger and so much fuller. Incidentally, it may not look like it's made much of a change, plus 18 samples. However, the phase has been flipped on the snare bottom. So that's what this button here does, this switch here. So it's detected that the snare bottom needed to move 18 samples forward and needed to be flipped. And so that is why that's the big change that's happened here. If that phase was not flipped, this would sound pretty terrible. So we'll just actually show you what it would sound like if I flip it back around. As soon as I flip that phase, it gets so much more body. So now that we've got the kick and the snare in phase, let's have a look at how we're going to treat getting the toms in phase. This is the only part of correcting the phase with Auto Align where things are not necessarily as straightforward as they are versus the other parts of the drum. So what I'm going to do is I'll set up a section where we have a decent amount of rack tom 1 running, and I've actually got it set up to a loop. So it's just going to loop this section over. And what I'm going to do is I'll set it up to run where it's being sent from the overhead, and we'll have that detecting and see how it goes getting that phase corrected for those tom hits. And it's going to repeat the same thing over quite a few times until it gets it in phase. So it's detected the phase needs to go plus 131 samples, and it's also flipped the phase as well. That's actually quite a decent change there. Effectively, you do the same thing going through for tom 2 and also for tom 3 as well. So in this particular case, I use this section here for tom 2 and tom 3. And what I'll do is I'll just bypass the corrected phase, and we can listen to what it sounds like for those sections there with just the overheads. And then with the corrected phase. Much better. So now that we've got all the shells in phase, I'm just going to have a look at the spot microphones, starting off with the hi-hats. Now, in this particular song, The only consistent section with hi-hats is this very first part of the second verse. When you are getting your spot microphones for your cymbals in phase, you want to make sure you pick a section that has a lot of playback of that particular cymbal. So that's what I've got going on here. I've got it receiving from the left overhead. The input has been brought down quite a lot because the hi-hats are very quiet, as has the sidechain as well. And it's picking up on the snare transient to determine whether or not it's in phase or not. So let's detect that right now. And that was super quick. And as you can see, it's detected that the hi-hats need to move forward plus 96 samples. So now that we've got that going, let's get the ride in phase as well. So I'll just bypass what we've got there. And we'll move over to this section here where we can see a decent amount of the ride cymbal. And we've got it being sent from the left overhead again as well. And let's detect that phase. So it's detected that the phase needs to be flipped on the ride, and it also needs to be moved forward plus 186 samples. So now I've gone through and made all of the corrections that I want to make with Audio Align, and I've got these drums as phase consistent as I want to make them for this, and they're ready to be bounced for mixing. Now, you might have noticed that I haven't done any phase correction in respect to the room mics. And the reason that I haven't done that is because I don't actually want to put the room mics totally in phase using Audio Align with the rest of the kit. Because if I do, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to affect that sound of the room, the distance that's been created by the difference of the timing of, you know, a snare being hit and the snare top microphone picking it up right next to that audio waveform source. And then the sound of the snare carrying all the way across the large room and being picked up by the room microphones. That actual time distance is what helps to create that bigness, that largeness that you get from room microphones. So I specifically don't actually correct and put the phase of the room microphones to match that of the closed microphones. I do make sure that the room mics themselves are in phase with each other. However, I generally speaking do that as part of the engineering process and use measurements to determine that the room mics, that is the stereo pair of room mics that I'm using, are going to be in phase with each other. As you can see here, looking at the room microphones themselves, they are effectively in phase. There's a minor difference here between these room microphones here. This right room is a slightly more forward than the left room is, but I'm not going to use Audio Align to correct them and match them with the overhead and the rest of the shells. So what we're going to do now that we've done all of the phase correction there, we're going to have a listen to this end section, and I'm going to turn Audio Align on for every single one of these microphones that I've put it on and turn it off. And then you'll hear the difference of what all of that phase correction has done to the original waveforms. You can hear Audio Align is doing quite a lot to get things nice and punchy and powerful. I definitely recommend you look at using it in your productions, and I hope that this was a useful video for you. So there you have it, a quick review of phase and how getting it right in your drum recordings is going to make them more powerful, punchy, and awesome. But I'd love to hear from you about what you do to get your drum recordings sounding awesome. Throw a comment below and let me know. Don't forget we have a free vocal production course that teaches you the basics of recording, editing, and mixing your vocals. But for now, take it easy. But it's